The penthouse windows just exploded, and the city's deadliest mafia boss is bleeding out in her arms. Leia used to flinch at shadows, but as bullets tear through the walls, she refuses to leave the man who saved her life. With an empty gun and a desperate bluff, she's about to take down heavily armed assassins. She isn't just surviving anymore, she's going to war, and the streets will run red. Picture this. The freezing rain batters the broken concrete, stealing the bottle from Leah Vance as she bleeds out in a nameless alley. Tossed aside like yesterday's trash by Ethan, the very man who swore to protect her. As her heartbeat slows to a quiet rhythm, the shadows shift, making way for someone far more dangerous. Adrian Romano steps into the weak streetlight. He is no white knight. He is a man who collects broken souls, to trading one kind of cage for another. Today, you and I are going to unpack this tragic cycle together, because watching Leah's fall teaches us a harsh but simple truth. Sometimes just surviving the darkest night demands that we make peace with the monsters hiding in the shadows. Let the camera hold still on her shattered frame. The tries to wash away the red ed pooling beneath her, but there is simply too much of it. Every shallow breath she takes drives a sharp spike of agony deep into her crushed ribs. One eye is completely swollen shut, painted a heavy bruised purple. She tries to shift her weight, but a blinding flash of pain robs the scream right from her throat. The man who left her here was no stranger. It was Ethan, 6 years ago, surrounded by friends and music. He played the perfect gentleman, hiding his cruelty behind warm coffee and sweet words. It leaves us with a painful reminder. The most dangerous threats at lives often hide right behind the most beautiful and convincing smiles. For 2,000 days, Ethan quietly chipped away at her spirit, turning a vibrant woman into a ghost who constantly walked on eggshells. Tonight is the violent climax to that silent erasure. He shoved her into the car. His eyes showed zero impulsive rage. Anger is human, after all. His face was total blank, wearing the terrifying efficiency of a man closing a bad business deal. He dragged her alley out into the wet street by her hair, landing each blow with chilling focus. "You have become a liability," he whispered, his voice dead flat as his fist struck her trembling frame. He threw her away simply because she was no longer his to perfectly control. It shows us a sobering reality. True cruelty is rarely born from fiery passion, but from a complete, devastating indifference to another human soul. She tried to beg him from a heartbreaking act when the man towering over you possesses zero empathy. Her voice cracked into fragile sobs, while he stared down with the cold finality of someone tossing out old mail. He left her to bleed out alone in that rotting alleyway. As the edges of her vision turned black, Leah slipped into the quiet comfort of her own mind. She pictured her mother's gentle face. She mourned the bright, hopeful girl she was before Ethan dug his claws into her life. Lying in the freezing mud, giving up felt like a blessing compared to living another day in constant terror. She surrendered to the dark. But life teaches us a strange lesson. Right when we finally accept the absolute, and fate drops heavy footsteps into the pouring rain. The steady rhythm of those footsteps carried no hesitation. These were the heavy strides of a wolf at home in the midnight shadows. Leah forced her good eye open just a crack. A massive silhouette blocked the distant streetlights. For one heart-stopping second, her panicked brain thought Ethan had returned. But this man moved with a different kind of weight. The pale light revealed hardened features and eyes that had swallowed 1,000 horrors without blinking. He stopped right beside her. He offered no gasp of pity, just a long, measuring stare. It reminds us that salvation rarely rides in on a white horse. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the deepest darkness, quietly weighing the true price of pulling us back from the edge. Leah tried to speak, but her ruined throat only pushed out a desperate rattle. The towering stranger crouched beside her in the mud. Up close, his violent history was carved into his skin, anchored by a jagged scar through his brow. His dark eyes mapped her wounds with the cold precision of a medical examiner. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beneath the rain. "My husband," she whispered. A tiny shift crossed his rigid face. It was not kindness. It was the terrifying focus of a predator catching a scent. "Ethan Vance," he murmured, confirming a truth he already knew. He slipped off his heavy coat and draped it over her. It is a profound truth that in our most shattered moments, even the temporary warmth offered by a monster can feel exactly like saving grace. Stick with me, because you and I know exactly how this tragic dance begins. This is how the trap is set. "You are not dying in this alley," he told her, his tone empty of warmth. "I cannot go on," she sobbed, her spirit crushed. "Please, leave me." He stared down at her broken form. "You really want your story to end in the garbage?" "I just want the pain to stop," she confessed, tears mixing with the rain. "It will," he promised. He slid his arms beneath her back, sending a blinding wave of agony tearing through her spine. She let out a jagged cry as he lifted her easily, ignoring her weak struggles. It teaches us a haunting lesson. Sometimes the very hands that pull us out of the dirt only intend to lock us securely inside a private cage of their own design. He moved through the storm with the chilling calm of a man who owned the night. "Who are you?" Leah gasped, tasting copper and rain as she choked on the words. "Adrian Romano," he answered. The sheer weight of that name struck her like a physical blow. In their city, Romano was a whispered ghost story. He was the king of the underworld, a man whose reputation for brutality made her husband's cruelty look like a game, her heart hammered against her broken ribs in pure terror. "No, I cannot go with you," she begged weakly. "You do not get a say in this anymore," he replied, locking her into the dark leathers of his back seat before she could even try to run. We must remember this bitter truth. Trading a familiar devil for an unknown demon rarely brings anyone true freedom. Let us take a closer look at this terrible shift in power. Her battered body was rapidly shutting down. Romano laid her across the expensive car seats with terrifying detachment, touching her not with kindness, but with the steady grip of a thief evaluating a stolen painting. "Why are you helping me?" Leah cried softly, searching his face for a drop of mercy. His dark eyes locked onto hers, empty of warmth yet burning with a dangerous sense of possession. "I am not helping you," he whispered, sealing her fate in a single breath. "I acquired you." A sharp prick bit into her neck, and a heavy darkness instantly dragged her under. It is a harsh lesson about vulnerability. True powerlessness is not the moment we fall, but the moment another person decides if we are ever allowed to wake up again. Stay with me, because this is the exact moment the invisible chains are forged. Leah woke to a heavy, suffocating silence designed to make her question reality. Her blurred eyes drifted to a soaring ceiling lined with dark trim. She was buried in a massive bed, her skin wrapped in expensive silk that did not belong to her. While she slept, foreign hands had completely remade her. Her broken ribs were tightly bound. A steady haze of painkillers drifted through her blood, dulling the sharp agony of Ethan's betrayal. Romano had meticulously stitched her broken body back together. But in life, we must realize a dangerous truth. When a monster heals your deepest wounds, it is usually just so you are strong enough to endure the beautiful new cage they have built for you. The realization that a stranger had dressed her wounds and locked her in this room sent a wild jolt of panic to her heart. A raw fear took over. She threw herself upward, desperately trying to escape the bed. But it was a terrible mistake. A white-hot blade of pain ripped through her side, biting her lip until she tasted blood. She forced herself against the dark headboard. Her wide eyes scanned the room. Heavy velvet curtains choked out the sun. The main door looked as heavy as a bank vault, and a second doorway showed only a cold marble bathroom. Shaking, she slid her bare feet over the mattress edge. It proves that our survival instinct never sleeps. Even when our bodies are totally broken, the human spirit desperately searches for a way out of the dark. Every movement sent alarms through her nerves, but Leah stubbornly forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled violently. Gripping the bedpost, she took ragged breaths to keep from blacking out. The heavy door clicked open. A woman in a sharp suit walked in, carrying a tray with water and pills. "You are not strong enough to walk," the woman stated, her voice hollow. "Where am I?" Leah demanded, forcing her chin high. "The Romano estate." "I need to leave right now," Leah shot back. The woman just stared at her with a terrifying cold authority. It offers a bitter lesson about pride. The master of the house already knows you will collapse before you reach the bottom of the stairs. Sometimes the absolute cruelest cages we find ourselves in are simply the ones with open doors. Margaret stood perfectly still, dismantling layer piece by shattered piece with a single glance. "If you keep fighting, I will just let you," she stated. Leah pushed up, her voice trembling as she called it unlawful detention. The operative offered a devastating correction. "He stepped in to keep your heart beating." "I never asked for his help," Leah snapped. "No," Margaret agreed, her chilling tone freezing the room. "You were entirely occupied with the process of dying." That absolute truth drained the fight from Leah. Margaret laid out the stark reality. Rest and heal, or resist and hurt. We often believe outside forces hold us back in life, but sometimes our own stubbornness becomes our ultimate cage. Defeated, Leah sank into the mattress, crushed by the loss of her autonomy. Let us step into this darkened room together, you and I, watch and watch psychological tragedy unfold. The camera pans across a heavy silver tray, holding painkillers and water. Margaret places it down with a hollow clatter. Leah shrinks back against the pillows, eyes wide, trapped in the hypervigilance of a hunted animal. "Are these safe?" she whispers. Margaret looks down with clinical coldness. "If Mr. Romano wanted you dead, you would be dead. It is the absolute logic of an apex predator." Leah swallows the pill dry, her shaking hands betraying a shattered nervous system. Margaret promises a meal in 1 hour, and the heavy door clicks locked. The abused mind teaches us a bitter life lesson. We so often flee one controlling monster only to blindly lock ourselves inside the beautiful gilded cage of another. The lighting shifts, catching the fading purple contusions on Leah's cheek. 3 days dissolve in the suffocating silence of isolation. Her fractured ribs ache less now, but the psychological dread only deepens. Her husband had a clear objective. He wanted her dead, but the motives of Adrian Romano remain buried in deep shadow. Margaret materializes 3 times a day, moving with the cold efficiency of a warden. Whenever Leah begs for a phone or her coordinates, the answer is always a flat refusal dictated from the boss above. It is a gilded prison bathed in warm sunlight. A simple truth we must all learn in life is that comfortable cages are still cages. They are meticulously designed to strip away your autonomy, piece by piece, solemnized until you simply resist to the locked doors. Pay close attention to the set design of her captivity. The room is breathtaking, yet utterly inescapable. The towering windows are permanently sealed against the outside world. The heavy oak door remains locked from the corridor. She is granted every physical comfort except the fundamental right of freedom. On the fourth day, the deadbolt finally slides back. Adrian Romano steps into the frame. Leia is curled by the window, staring at lush gardens she cannot touch. At the heavy thud of his footsteps, her spine snaps straight. He lingers near the exit, hands resting casually in his pockets. He dissects her with the clinical detachment of a syndicate leader evaluating his property. The life lesson here is stark. Power is not always loud. Often, true power is simply the quiet ability to control the very air in a room. You are healing well, he observes, his voice void of human empathy. Leia remains perfectly still, offering no verbal response to his psychological baseline test. Margaret says you have been cooperative, he adds. Leia's jaw sledges. Oh, what do you want from us, she demands, her voice sharper than her defensive posture. Adrian takes a seat, projecting absolute physical relaxation and total dominance. We need to talk, he states quietly. Then talk. He leans forward. Your husband tried to kill you. A violent micro-expression of grief tears across her pale face. I know that, she whispers. Do you know why? Does it matter? She deflects. Yes, Adrian presses. You were the collateral. Ethan was drowning in debt. Desperate people will gladly sacrifice those closest to them just to survive a coming storm. He targeted the vigilant. I don't understand, she breathes, confusion clouding her eyes. He used you as bait, depositing you in my territory, knowing I would locate you. A visceral drop hollows out her stomach. Why would he assume that? Because I control that sector, Adrian states, his tone dripping with the grandiosity of a true megalomaniac. If I took you, Ethan could claim victimization. If I ignored you, you would expire, and he would play the grieving widower for sympathy. The crushing psychological weight of this betrayal hits Leia like a physical blow. Her knuckles turn white. He planned all of it just to close a business deal. Adrian nods. Life teaches us a devastating lesson here. True betrayal never comes from our sworn enemies. It only ever comes from the very people we chose to trust the most. Leia spent years documenting Ethan's capacity for violence in the dark ledgers of her mind. Yet this profound calculation, this sociopathic disregard for her humanity, shatters her core psychological schema. Why are you telling me this, she whispers, her reality unraveling. Because you deserve to know the precise market value of your life to him, Adrian replies. And what is it worth to you? That depends entirely on whether you wish to survive or merely exist. I don't belong in your dark world, she counters, chest heaving. You didn't belong in his either, but you stayed. I didn't have a choice, she defends weakly. Adrian slowly stands, adjusting his tailored suit. A vital life lesson echoes in his next response. No matter how trapped we feel, we always retain the power of choice. Stick with me here, because you and I are about to watch the trap be masterfully set. I will secure transport to another city, Adrian offers casually. I will provide untraceable currency and fabricated identification to help you disappear. A surge of dopamine floods her damaged system. Really? She breathes. He moves toward the exit, pausing deliberately for psychological effect. But if you flee, Ethan will track you. He has the resources. You will spend your days in paranoid flight until he catches you. The brief spark of hope dies in her eyes. Or, Adrian continues, laying the dark foundation for a trauma bond. You stay in my facility. You heal. It is a grim life lesson about control. True manipulation does not force a decision upon someone. It simply makes every other option look like a guaranteed death sentence. Leia frantically processes the strategic variables. Why would you protect me? Because Ethan committed a fatal error. Adrian replies coldly. He believed he could use you against my empire and walk away. I don't let miscalculations go unpunished. She stares at him. So I am simply bait for your agenda now. A flicker of dark amusement crosses his shadowed features. No, you are a choice. What do you extract from this? She demands, ignoring her screaming ribs, to stand up. Adrian studies her trembling frame. I gain the profound satisfaction of watching Ethan realize he discarded the only piece on the board that possessed true value. He exits the room. We learn an empowering life lesson here. Sometimes reclaiming your self-worth starts the exact moment you realize the people who threw you away underestimated your true power. We have all faced incredibly hard choices in life, but watch how her fractured mind justifies this one. The days blur as Leia runs a desperate risk assessment. She chooses captivity. Not because she trusts Adrian. Trusting a Mafia kingpin is a dangerous cognitive distortion. She stays because the alternative guarantees an early grave. Constant flight requires unsustainable cortisol levels, whereas staying grants her space to build a survival strategy. Slowly, Margaret transitions from a silent warden into a cautious confidant. While changing Leia's bandages, she reveals she has served Adrian for 12 years. Before that, she was tethered to a violently abusive partner. The life lesson here is incredibly dark, yet undeniable. Sometimes, in a deeply broken world, true salvation arrives wearing the face of a terrifying monster. Mr. Romano presented an escape route, Margaret explains, securing the gauze. He rarely intervenes, but when he does, his ownership becomes absolute. No one touches what belongs to him. Leia feels a deep, reflexive rejection. I don't belong to him, she asserts firmly. Margaret offers a micro-expression of sad resignation. Not yet. That chilling phrase plants a seed of profound psychological unrest in Leia's mind. Adrian's visits become sporadic. He materializes at unpredictable intervals, maintaining his dominance through the classic tactic of intermittent reinforcement. He checks her metrics and vanishes. A quiet life lesson hums beneath the surface here. True control is never forced upon a person. It is slowly cultivated until the cage simply feels like home. On the 10th day, the pattern shatters. Adrian steps inside with an unknown man. Adrian strides into the room, followed by a man carrying a medical bag. The newcomer presents a calming demeanor, introducing himself as Dr. Castellano. I require a full medical evaluation, Adrian commands. Ensure no damage was overlooked. Leia's psychological defense mechanisms activate instantly. I'm functioning fine, she insists. Yeah, you were subjected to near-lethal blunt force trauma. Adrian counters his face a chilling mask of flat affect. Yeah, you're not fine. You're not fine. Yeah, submit to the examination. She feels the desperate urge to resist, but she suddenly recognizes the tragic normalization of her own chronic pain. She silently yields. The life lesson we must draw from this is crucial. Healing can only begin the moment we finally stop pretending the deep wounds don't exist. Dr. Castellano proceeds with the methodical assessment, documenting her vitals in a journal. Let us examine how identity functions in the aftermath of trauma. The physician, 3 fractured ribs, fading contusions. You survived against odds, Mrs. Vance, he says. At that surname, Leia recoils as if struck by a physical blow. Do not refer to me by that title, she commands. The doctor blinks, missing sociological bleeding. Adrian steps from the shadows, his voice a sharp blade. She has discarded that identity, he asserts, forcing the physician to retreat. Leia immediately challenges his presumption, reminding him she is still legally bound to her abuser. Adrian meets her gaze evenly. Not for much longer, he replies. Sometimes. The first genuine step went toward healing is shedding that the person who broke you forced you to wear that Adrian delivers the truth, like a judge handing down a sentence. Ethan made his deal with the Viscari syndicate 3 days ago, he explains. Her husband used her staged kidnapping to play the weeping widower, trading tech for smuggling routes. Leia struggles for breath, twisting her gown. He is moving forward, she whispers. He replaced you. Adrian replies coldly. The speed of her erasure hits Leia like a physical blow. I need to see him, she demands in a blind panic. Adrian blocks the door, warning her that Ethan only uses people to polish his public mask. We often long to confront our abusers, but the bravest thing we can do is refuse to look back at the fire that nearly turned us to ash. Stick with me on this one, because this is the exact moment the broken try to take back their narrative. I am not asking for permission, Leia snaps. Her voice is forged steel, even as her frail fingers tremble. I must look him in the eye and make him see I survived. Adrian crosses the floor, his tall frame shutting her escape. And then what? He challenges. He laughs at you, and you fall apart. Then I fall apart, she fires back. But it will be my own choice. Adrian studies the desperate defiance carved into her face. You do not have the armor for this yet, he murmurs. When she refuses to flinch, he pulls out his phone and the glowing screen toward her. The hardest choices in life are always the ones we must own entirely, even when they break our hearts. Let us look at the invisible chains of trauma together. On that glowing screen, Leia watches Ethan smiling at a gala, his hand resting on the waist of a new woman. The oxygen leaves Leia in a rush. Her chest caves inward as the sick reality of her replaceability washes over her. Adrian watches her shatter, applying just enough cold truth to anchor her spiraling mind. He threw you away, he states simply. Leia curls her hands into tight fists, desperately wanting to scream at the man who ruined her life. Adrian takes a deliberate step backward, offering her nothing to fight against. He forces her to find her own footing. The lesson here is brutal, but necessary. Holding on to the source of your suffering only guarantees your deepest wounds will never truly close. Adrian walks out, pulling the heavy door shut and plunging her into isolation. The click of the lock sends Leia spinning into a silent panic. For 6 long years, her entire psychology was built around waiting for Ethan and his next violent outburst. Stripped of that terror, her traumatized mind has no idea how to function. The silence grows so deafening that something dark and primal finally claws its way out of the emptiness. By morning, her body vibrates with a fierce, angry energy. She drops to the cold floor, forcing her weak muscles through punishing exercises, desperate to reclaim her own flesh. Sometimes the most terrifying truth a survivor faces is that their soft past self is dead, entirely replaced by a person built for war. The rage burning inside her is just a heavy cloak, a psychological shield hiding the crushing grief of being discarded so easily. Leia paces the shadowed hallways of the compound, her bare feet slapping the concrete. She pushes through double doors and freezes inside a massive combat room. Mirrored walls throw the harsh light back at her. Thick leather, heavy bags hang from steel chains like silent adversaries. Leia stares at her reflection, as if looking at a ghost. She sees a hollow, bruised woman, her skin painted in the ugly, lingering colors of abuse. Slowly, her trembling hand reaches out to press against the rough leather. True healing does not start when a room finally feels safe. It begins the exact second you decide to strike back at the silence. Watch closely how the atmosphere shifts. The marksman steps into the room. His sudden voice makes Leia jump violently, her nervous system still reacting to the phantom ghosts of her past. Marcus is an imposing figure, his jaw lined with silver scars, yet his dark eyes watch her with calm patience. Instantly, Leia raises her chin and crossing her arms defensively over her bruised ribs. She spits out a quick excuse, desperate to pound her fists against the leather to drown out the noise in her mind. Marcus slowly shakes his head, refusing to let her tear her own body apart in the false name of therapy. "You are done hurting yourself," he tells her gently. "True recovery takes immense patience. You simply cannot outrun your nightmares by punishing the very body that barely survived them. I did everything right, and he still broke my bones," Leia yells. Raw defiance pours out of her like blood from an open wound. She is completely done playing the compliant victim. Marcus does not offer her empty platitudes. He looks at her battered face and bluntly agrees that she has been beaten half to death. Hearing a stranger speak of her darkest secret so casually makes Leia feel sick. The awful realization that every detail of her humiliation makes her feel exposed in the harsher light. Yet, instead of looking down on her, Marcus points a scarred finger toward the center of the padded mat. He is giving her a safe place to pour out the fire. Our pain always demands a witness, but more importantly, it requires a disciplined outlet before it burns us to ash. Marcus sees right through her defenses. He knows she has no emotional armor left, so he offers to build her a physical one. Watch her bare feet step onto the mat. It is the first proactive choice she has made in years. For an agonizing hour, Marcus breaks down her flinching reflexes. He teaches her how to roll with a strike, overriding the freeze response Ethan had systematically beaten into her. When the session ends, Leia's muscles scream in agony, but as she wipes the sweat from her brow, a faint spark flickers in her eyes. Deedon is different. This pain belongs to her alone. It is not a punishment from a cruel husband, but a fire she walked into willingly. The hardest lesson we ever learn is that choosing serenity is the very first step toward true freedom. The grueling session concludes with Marcus handing her a strict daily schedule, providing her chaotic mind a much-needed anchor. When Leia gasps for breath and asks why he cares, Marcus looks away. "Adrian ordered it," he mutters, but the haunted look in his dark eyes hints at his own buried nightmares. Leia watches the rigid set of his shoulders, recognizing the distinct posture of someone who had to become a monster just to survive one. 2 floors above, Adrian watches the exchange on a glowing monitor, his face an unreadable mask of calculation. Beside him, Dante scoffs at her frantic champagne, calling it pure manic desperation. But empathy hides in strange places. Murmurs of those who have clawed their way out of the abyss of the darkest are often the only ones capable of guiding us back to the light. Up in the surveillance room, Dante argues for cold pragmatism, while Adrian plays the calculating architect. "Let her rest," Dante insists. But Adrian knows the psychological truth. Leaving a severely traumatized mind in a quiet room only breeds madness. "She needs a war to fight," Adrian counters softly, "or she will shatter completely." Outside these walls, the underworld is whispering. Rival families assume Adrian saved the woman solely for political leverage. Worse, Ethan has taken his act to the media. The arrogant husband weeps on television, claiming Adrian kidnapped him, spinning his own crimes into a tragic romance. It is a timeless, sickening truth. The cruelest abusers will always play the bleeding victim the very second they lose control over you. Look closely with me here, because this is where the game turns deadly. Ethan never wanted his wife back. His public tears were just a pathetic excuse to hunt down his enemies. Dante sees the storm coming and demands they throw Leia out to the wolves to save their empire. "Cut the dead weight," he urges. But Adrian stands perfectly still, refusing the logical choice. Dante stares at his boss, bewildered by this crack of mercy in a man famous for having a heart of stone. On the grainy security screen, Adrian watches Leia stumble to her knees, spit blood, and force herself back to her feet. Without realizing it, Adrian lets out a heavy breath, a tight feeling seizing his chest. The human soul cannot be entirely buried. Even the most ruthless men will bow to a survivor's sheer unbreakable will. Let us take a close look at the lies we tell ourselves. Adrian tries to mask his twisted obsession with cold, calculated business, insisting to Dante that the broken woman upstairs is nothing but a weapon to dismantle Ethan. But Dante sees right through the smoke. He quietly reminds Adrian that weaponizing someone's trauma makes him no different from the monster who inflicted it. The truth strikes hard, leaving Adrian's hands clenched in the sudden, crushing weight of his own hypocrisy. Upstairs, the fog of survival is lifting from Leia's mind. She corners a quiet maid named Margaret, her eyes burning with a desperate need for answers. No matter how deep the darkness gets, the human spirit will eventually claw its way out, demanding the brutal truth from what we refuse to see, even when the light hurts our eyes. Leia stands rigid, desperately, trying to build a fortress out of her own fragile morality. She demands to know why Margaret would shield a criminal like Adrian. But the older woman does not flinch. Instead, she quietly turns the mirror on Leia, asking her to look at her own husband. Ethan commits a sanitized corporate brutality every single day, hiding his cruelty behind pressed collars. In a single, breathless second, Leia's defense collapses. Her eyes widen as the suffocating reality takes hold. We spend so much of our lives pointing at the obvious villains in the shadows, blind to the ones sitting at our dinner tables. A well-tailored suit is often the most dangerous disguise a monster can wear, simply because we refuse to look for the blood on his hands. The pale moonlight spills across the bed, framing a woman who is completely unraveling. Sleep refuses to come for her. Instead, her mind obsessively loops the violence, replaying the exact second Ethan's fist met bone in the deafening quiet of her room. The fading bruises on her ribs are no longer just painful injuries. They are heavy, undeniable receipts of the man he actually is. She can never again dismiss it as just a stressful night at the office. The cold, jagged truth strips away every desperate excuse she ever built to protect his image. Gasping for air, she throws the blankets aside and bolts from the room, running from her own memory. Facing the ugly reality about someone you deeply love will completely shatter your heart, but that destruction is the only way you can ever truly begin to rebuild. She drifts through the sleeping estate like a ghost, haunting her very own tragedy. Pushing into the sprawling, dimly lit library, she steps through something solid to ground her. She runs a trembling finger along the dustless spines of the books, searching for order in a world that has lost its mind. Then comes the sharp clink of ice crystal. She freezes. There, seated deep in the velvet shadows, is Adrian. He holds a glass of amber whiskey, his dark eyes silently tracking her across the room. He does not yet yell or try to intimidate her. He just sits in the heavy dark, letting his mere presence pull the air from the room. We often confuse loud aggression with power, but true strength never has to shout to be heard. It simply waits in the quiet, completely confident that you will eventually come to it. You and I have probably seen this exact trap spring shut before, disguised as a rescue. Adrian leans forward, the sharp lines of his face softening into a mask of aching exhaustion. He offers her sanctuary, speaking with a gentle warmth that finally makes her cry out her heavy, long-carried shame. He calmly explains how men like a husband build entire, beautiful worlds just to keep a bird caged. But Leia is finally waking up, and she wipes a straight hair, her chin trembling, and asks if he's doing the exact same thing to her right now. A slow, chilling smile touches his lips as he simply nods and says yes. It is a terrifying realization. Sometimes the most dangerous lies we fall for are the ones wrapped in absolute brutal honesty, because we mistake a predator's confession for genuine vulnerability. The dim glow of the library casts jagged shadows across Adrian's face as he delivers the flat, unvarnished truth. He admits he is using her as a crowbar to rip her husband's empire apart. It is a masterful but terrifying stroke of psychological manipulation. By admitting she is just a pawn, he ironically gives her the one thing Ethan never offered, the truth. When she spits bitterly that she is nothing but a stray dog to him, Adrian stands, stepping so close she can feel his heat. He praises the wild, unbroken fight burning in her eyes. It is a deeply uncomfortable lesson about human nature. The people who tell us exactly how they plan to use us are almost impossible to walk away from, because the illusion of transparency makes it feel like we are somehow in control of our own destruction. The air between them crackles with a thick, suffocating tension. Adrian slowly walks circles around her, his sharp eyes catching the subtle way she guards her bruised ribs. He begins to strip away her emotional armor, whispering that she is terrified of being caged, yet entirely paralyzed by the thought of being alone. Her hands ball into tight fists. She begs him to unlock the heavy gates and let her walk away. He refuses, his voice dropping low as he reminds her that her husband is currently hunting her with a loaded gun. The cold reality locks her feet right to the floor. It is a compromise we make when we are broken. We will gladly accept a slightly larger cage and call it freedom, simply because the monster waiting just outside the bars has much sharper teeth. She screams that she is no one's property, the raw sound bouncing off the high, dark walls. Adrian steps intimately close, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her wet cheek. He softly promises that he only wants to keep her breathing. Leia stares back, hollow and exhausted, whispering that in his violent world, survival and ownership are the exact same thing. We jump to 3 days later. The heavy, rhythmic thud of fists against leather fills the gym as Leia punishes the heavy bag. Suddenly, a nervous guard steps in, announcing that Adrian requires her presence. The invisible chain pulls tight around her neck. We often fight so incredibly hard to prove we have won our freedom, only to realize the leash never broke. It just quietly slipped into someone else's hand. Walk with me down this clanging hallway, and you can practically feel the heavy dread sinking like a stone in Leia's stomach. Every single step through the sprawling estate is a harsh reminder of her own powerlessness. 2 armed guards push open the towering double doors, thrusting her into a cold, glass-walled office that looks out over the grounds like an emperor's throne room. Adrian does not even bother to turn around. He stands at the window, barking ruthless commands into his phone, letting the crushing weight of his silence shrink her down to nothing. It is a classic display of dominance. People obsessed with control will always go out of their way to show you exactly how small they think you are, long before they ever demand your surrender. Adrian drops the phone and turns with a slow, terrifying grace. With a barely visible flick of his wrists, the heavy doors slam shut, the lock echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. He moves around the dark wood desk, his face completely empty, and fires a rapid, cutting question about her husband's offshore money. Leia stumbles backward, stuttering out blind guesses about corporate patents. Then he drops the name of a hidden bleeding edge project. Her knees practically give out beneath her, a scarred and 4 steps from the shadows, sliding a massive damning file across the smooth glass. The pages spill out with undeniable proof. The darkest, most dangerous secrets are rarely hiding in the shadows. They are usually sleeping right beside us, waiting for the perfect moment to wake up. The harsh fluorescent light beats down as Leia's trembling fingers trace that black ink. Words like surveillance and offshore accounts blur into a sickening reality. Adrian stands right over her shoulder, his voice a low, steady hum, as he maps out how her husband dressed up violent, blood-soaked money in a pressed corporate suit. When she chokes back a sob and asks how he uncovered all of this, Adrian's eyes go dead cold. He states plainly that a man only beats his wife half to death if he is terrified why knows too much. He too simply followed her blood directly back to the money. It is a deeply unsettling truth about the world we live in. Unchecked greed will gladly turn a blind eye to absolutely any human suffering as long as the check clears at the end of the day. The room begins to spin wildly, forcing her to grip the edge of the glass desk just to stay standing. Adrian leans in to deliver the final crushing blow. He looks her dead in the eyes and explains that the brutal beating was never about a loss of temper. It was just a clean, calculated corporate write-off. She was a liability. We watch closely as the last 10 years of her life turn to ash in seconds. Every sweet anniversary, every gentle kiss, it was all a beautifully staged play. She whispers to the empty air that she never did anything wrong. Adrian places a heavy, grounding hand on her shoulder, agreeing with her. The deepest, most devastating betrayals never come from our sworn enemy. They always come from the exact people who promised to keep us safe from the dark. We have finally reached the edge of the cliff together. Adrian leans down, his voice barely a whisper as he outlines the brutal, bloody cost of what comes next. If they pull this trigger, the syndicate will hunt them with everything they have. Leia looks up, her tears completely gone. Her eyes are now as hard as flint as she snarls that she does not care. He backs her against the wall, demanding she say exactly what she wants to happen to the man who broke her. Her chest heaves, fueled by pure, unadulterated hatred, and she begs for Ethan to feel every single ounce of the agony he caused. A terrifying smile spreads across Adrian's face. True vengeance never leaves you with clean hands. It will always demand a massive piece of your own soul as the final payment. The camera drifts across the dimly lit room, coming to rest on Adrian. His voice is a steady rumble as he maps out the slow demolition of Ethan's criminal empire, a plan designed to strip away absolutely everything but the man's breath. Across from him sits, with her hands trembling violently, a storm of pure rage brewing beneath her skin. She refuses this quiet path. She demands the visceral release of facing her tormentor in person, and desperate to look directly into the abyss that nearly swallowed her whole. You and I have probably both have made this exact same tragic mistake, believing that looking the devil in the eye will somehow extinguish this scorch's flames, when in truth, it only invites the fire to burn us further. Adrian's jaw tightens, the faint shift of bone illuminated by the stark, unforgiving overhead light. He is furious that his absolute authority has been challenged. A suffocating tension chokes the room until his lieutenant steps from the shadows, offering a gravelly murmur of agreement. He argues that letting a sleeping monster lie only makes him deadlier when he wakes. Adrian's cold gaze slices toward Leia, warning her of the fatal crosshairs she is painting squarely upon her own chest. But she refuses to blink, transforming right before our eyes from a shattered victim into an unyielding combatant. The prey has finally bared her teeth. We often forget in our own lives that true survival sometimes requires stepping willingly into the line of fire. The camera linger to the sleek, sling black fabric of Leia's gown as their heavily armored sedan glides quietly through the rain-slicked city streets. She has become a weapon forged from the ruins of a shattered wife. Her reflection in the cold glass betrays a hardened core, completely stripped of its innocence. Beside her, Adrian sits absolutely motionless, an obsidian statue of calculated violence anchoring her to this dangerous new reality. His voice cuts through the heavy air, a sterile hum hurting the psychological trap they have set beneath the blinding glare of restaurant chandeliers. It is a masterpiece of environmental control. Sometimes, we must wear the heavy armor of our darkest past to truly find the strength to walk away from it forever. Adrian promises lethal force to her abuser with the casual indifference of someone reading the morning weather report. Yet, underneath the luxurious folds of her dress, Leia's hands tremble wildly. Her entire nervous system hums with sheer, unadulterated terror. She presses her palms down hard against her thighs, firmly rejecting the final escape Adrian offers at the heavy oak doors. Stepping inside, the lighting is a bruised cinematic violet. Ethan sits perfectly at the far table, the absolute picture of tailored elegance, casually swirling his dark wine. He does not even flinch as she approaches, viewing her merely as a broken monsters rarely hide in the dark. They sit comfortably in the finest light. Ethan smiles, a thin, entirely lifeless upward curve of his lips, and politely remarks that she looks radiant. The sheer audacity of his greeting wraps around Leia's throat like a physical wire, choking the nervous breath right out of her lungs. Adrian's heavy hand rests on her spine for just a fraction of a second, acting as a silent anchor in a raging sea. Before he melts seamlessly into the shadows by the door, Leia forces the air down, her voice unnervingly steady, as she finally confronts the man who tried to end her life. He merely takes another slow sip of his deep red wine, sighing that her survival is terribly inconvenient for his grand design. It is a harsh truth we all eventually face. The people who break us almost never see themselves as the villain. The sharp clinking of silver against porcelain rings out loudly as Ethan casually writes off her brutalized body as a simple matter of accounting. He could not afford her questions, he murmurs, his eyes utterly devoid of the man she once believed she loved. Leia's nails carved deep crescents into her own palms, the sharp, biting pain grounding her fractured mind as Ethan dismisses her as an expired asset. Stick with me here, because this is where the psychological tragedy deepens. He glances at the shadows, assuming her new protector is only there to claim territory and watch her mentally shatter. Predators always assume a reference to the world operates with the exact same cold, calculating malice that they do. The camera slowly shifts to Ethan's calculating eyes, quietly waiting for her inevitable emotional collapse. He fully expects the desperate tears, the familiar, tragic symphony of a broken spirit meticulously orchestrated. But the weeping never comes. Instead, Leia leans across the stark white tablecloth, the heavy shadows contouring the sharp, unyielding angles of her face. She leans directly into the danger, whispering that she has absolutely nothing left for him to take. You and I must recognize this undeniable shift in the human spirit. When a victim finally stops fearing the fire that burned them, they become the very inferno the abuser cannot control. The ultimate power in this chaotic life is simply the absolute absence of fear. A microscopic twitch betrays the absolute practiced stillness of Ethan's face. It is not terror, but the chilling realization that his favorite puppet has permanently cut her own strings. He rises slowly, smoothing his expensive jacket, and delivers a quiet, venomous promise of death to Adrian within a month before disappearing into the evening rain. Instantly, the invisible scaffolding holding Leia upright completely shatters. The walls of the restaurant seem to blur and crush inward, her chest heaving as the adrenaline aggressively drains from her tired veins. Adrian's hand finds her shoulder, solid and unmoving, and she lets him guide her away. Even the strongest warriors must eventually allow themselves to be held when the brutal battle finally ends. The heavy steel doors of the escape vehicle seal shut, and the emotional dam finally breaks. Violent tremors rack Leia's slender frame, the sheer physical toll of survival violently flooding her exhausted nervous system. Adrian watches her in the dim, rhythmic flash of passing streetlights, his low voice cutting through the dark to remind her that panicked men may make erratic mistakes. Yet she just stares out the rain-streaked window, watching ordinary citizens walking under umbrellas, completely oblivious to the shadow war raging in their streets. It is the most isolating tragedy of surviving deep trauma. We walk among the living, carrying a heavy, invisible ghost story that no one else can see, hear, or even begin to understand. The bloody consequence of her bravery arrives in the dead, suffocating silence of 3 a.m. Leia lies awake, staring blankly at the ceiling, the phantom image of Ethan's dead eyes playing on a continuous loop in her exhausted mind. Suddenly, the heavy bedroom door splinters inward with a violent crash. Adrian fills the ruined doorframe, bathed in the sickly yellow hall light. He stands there as a terrifying monument of controlled rage, his voice a flat, deadpan hum as he announces the midnight slaughter of 4 of his best men. Let us pause and look at this moment together. True terror is not found in a screaming, unpredictable man, but in one who has silenced his humanity completely to prepare for an absolute bloodbath. The words hit her chest like a heavy, physical blow. The syndicate left a name in the wreckage. The room suddenly tilts, a violent wave of vertigo sending Leia crashing to the cold hardwood floor, her hands scrambling blindly against the grain as panic paralyzes her limbs. She chokes on the agonizing guilt, convinced her desperate need for closure has doomed them all to death. But Adrian kneels, his mass frame and completely blocking the chaotic shadows of the hallway, and forces her to look at him. He dismantles her misplaced guilt with cold, surgical precision, explaining that the narcissist is merely weaponizing her existence. We must never carry the heavy burden of the crimes committed by those who only seek to manipulate and destroy us. The camera follows them down the sweeping staircase into a sprawling mansion suddenly consumed by organized, militaristic chaos. Heavily armed men rack weaponry in the deep shadows, their movements sharp and lethal beneath the flickering crystal chandelier. Dante shouts of a sequence of harsh tactical commands, shoving a thick wool coat against Leia's trembling chest. In mere seconds, they are swallowed by the armored belly of an escape vehicle, the tires screaming aggressively against the wet asphalt. Leia's world narrows down to the deafening thunder of her own heartbeat, while Adrian sits in the absolute dark, casually outlining his plan to speak with the devil himself. Sometimes the absolute only way out of hell is to walk directly into the fire. The camera pushed in on Adrian, his face half hidden by the dim, passing streetlights. His singular goal is to build an unbreakable fortress around Leia, even if it means inviting a brutal bloodbath to his doorstep. Dante paces the floorboards, his voice tight with the cold, mathematical logic of their sheer disadvantage. But Adrian does not flinch. His expression remains carved from solid stone. He has a bargaining chip, dropping the name like a heavy gold coin. Ethan Vance. Leia's breath catches in her dry throat. Really, he is trading a human life to buy her freedom. It is a desperate wager. Adrian turns slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. The truth is painfully simple. Sometimes the only way to escape the darkness is to become entirely invisible to it. The crushing weight of the entire situation wraps around Leia's tired shoulders like a funeral shroud. The impending violence and sudden exile all flow directly from some stubborn need to confront her past. A whispered apology finally slips from her pale lips, torn out by a profound, agonizing sense of blame. Adrian, usually as unreadable as winter frost, softens just a fraction of an inch. He does not dismiss her pain, but gently commands her to step aside so he can focus on building their defenses. The scene cuts to a hidden penthouse, a cold cage of glass and steel stripped entirely of warmth. Leia stands totally frozen in the center of the floor, wrapping her arms tightly around her own ribs. Guilt, after all, is a much heavier cage than any physical prison. The syndicate demands a sit-down on their own waterfront turf, and let us be honest, it is a masterfully designed snare.
Adrian knows the sick gravity of this underworld better than anybody else breathing. You and I can clearly see the trap laid out before him. If he refuses the invitation, he broadcasts his own terror.
For the very first time, we watch his famous composure fracture. He exhales a harsh breath, dragging a shaky hand through his dark hair. They are hopelessly outgunned, marching straight toward us slaughter.
Leia pleads with him to stay behind, to send a pawn instead. But this ecosystem runs purely on ego, and sending a proxy means declaring war.
It reminds us of a bitter truth. Pride will always find a way to collect its deadly fee. Adrian speaks in a quiet tone, carrying the heavy weight of a man reading his own obituary. Striking back guarantees a massacre, Antica, but walking into their trap offers the exact same burial. Desperate, Leia steps up with a dangerous proposal, willing to trade her own breath for his. The quiet in that room feels heavy enough to break the floorboards. Adrian shuts her down with the sudden violence of a swinging door. Dismantles her plan piece by... The cartel would only use her as bait to pull him into the open, throwing her away the moment he dropped. She demands to know why he guards her so fiercely. He crosses the floor in 3 long steps, making her stare into the eyes of a cornered animal. It teaches us a simple truth. We only fight with everything we have when we are defending what we refuse to lose. He refuses to let her become collateral damage for his sins. Usmo says as he insists she was made for a world far away from this decay. Leia asks, her voice trembling, why he treats his own survival like a cheap commodity while treating hers like gold. The camera stays fixed on Adrian, capturing a silence so thick you could choke on it. When he finally pulls back, his answer carries the weight of true tragedy. She still holds enough light to build something beautiful. He genuinely believes his own spirit is covered in dirt that will never wash off. Before that heavy confession can fully sink in, his phone buzzes. He answers, and the blood vanishes from his cheeks. It is a stark reminder for all of us. The most devastating losses in our lives rarely arrive with a loud warning. The unspoken reality settles over the room like a heavy fog. Ethan is gone. The revelation hits Leia like a physical strike, forcing her to grab the edge of a chair just to keep her legs from collapsing. The details paint a grim picture. One single bullet staged perfectly to mimic a lonely suicide. Dante wastes no time, spitting out the Viscari name with pure venom. Adrian immediately shifts into calculation mode, his eyes darting as he maps out the disaster. Their only point of leverage has been wiped off the board. Leia just at the ground, asking why anyone would go this far. The answer comes down to the most basic rule of the criminal underground. A dead man tells no tales. In the end, we must realize that true loyalty does not exist among predators, only the desperate urge to stay alive. Now that Ethan is out of the picture, the deepest secrets of the crime family are buried in the dirt. Adrian calls off the sit-down without a second thought. The quiet game of chess is completely finished, replaced by a pure hunt. Leia sinks hard into her chair. The monster who ripped her world to shreds is finally dead, but the sweet relief she expected to feel is completely absent. The lens moves in close on her blank face, capturing a sudden, hollow space where victory should be. Adrian simply watches her fall apart. She whispers, her voice breaking, that she only wanted him to pay for what he did. Adrian responds with the ugly truth of his reality. We often seek revenge, thinking it will make us whole again. But watching a bad man fall usually leaves us with nothing but a cold and empty room. This moment is not a conclusion at all. It is simply the spin of a much darker wheel. Adrian crouches down to meet her gaze, finally dropping his guard completely. He admits how bone-tired he truly is, confessing a raw disgust for the empire he built. It is a shocking flash of honesty from a man made of stone. When she asks how he manages to wake up every day, his eyes reveal something terrifying. The tight control he relies on is shattering to pieces. Everything hangs suspended in silence until the massive windows blast inward. Instinct takes the wheel. Before Leia can even process the sound, Adrian tackles her to the floor, covering her body with his own as gunfire tears the room to shreds. It shows us what truly matters. Real devotion is only proven when the worst storm finally hits. Let's take a closer look at this moment together. Time slows down as sheer panic freezes Leia in place. The deafening roar of lead destroying the drywall fades away, replaced by the heavy thud of her own heartbeat. She forgets how to breathe. Completely paralyzed, she is pulled across the broken floorboards by Adrian. He is frighteningly steady, shifting instantly into a cold instrument of war. He pushes her toward Dante, who racks his gun with the dead eyes of a soldier. Adrian meets her gaze one last time, telling her to run and forget he ever existed. He is choosing to be the shield that breaks so she can live. She grabs his shirt, unwilling to release him. Extreme pressure does not change who we are. It simply burns away our polite fictions, revealing the raw truth underneath. Notice the absolute stone in his posture. Adrian slices right through her hysteria, using a voice that leaves zero room for argument. It is the bark of a boss who expects immediate surrender, but his eyes are overflowing with a quiet warmth. That lingering look tears her apart. He says he is sorry not just for the bullets, but for every shadow he ever brought into her life. Then, he turns and charges straight back into the smoke. Leia falls to the floor, pressing her hands against her ears as the seconds drag on like hours. Wood splinters everywhere as Tendansk kicks through it, order bleeding and fueled entirely by adrenaline. He drags her to her feet. We learn a hard lesson here. Sometimes, making it out of hell requires you to simply keep your eyes tightly closed to the horror around you. The lens follows them into the corridor. The sharp scent of spent powder makes it hard to breathe. Dante smashes the elevator button until the metal doors finally slide apart. An escape route is sitting right there. But in a sudden twist, Leia turns back toward the war zone. This is the tragic reality of a broken spirit. Throwing away the exact safety she spent months looking for, she rips her arm away from Dante and runs back into the thick grey haze. She cannot even see the gunman. She blindly follows the deafening noise, screaming his name until her voice cracks. It makes zero logical sense, but deep panic never consults logic. She trips at a broken column and stops cold at a dark shape on the floor. We must remember that we often confuse our deepest emotional wounds with our only true home. The untouchable boss is finally on the ground. Adrian leans against the chewed-up wall, a dark red circle growing fast across his shirt. His pistol gives a hollow click. The frightening calm that always surrounded him has vanished, leaving only cold sweat. He tries to tell her to get out, but the sentence ends barely as he scrapes past his lips. Leia drops hard to the floor next to him. Without pausing, she pushes her shaking hands directly into the warm flow of his blood, trying to hold his life inside his body. Dante rips through the smoke, shouting curses, and grabs Adrian to drag him toward the open elevator. You and I have to remember the lessons in this image. Ultimate power is a complete myth. The moment a piece of lead hits bone, every single king bleeds out onto the floor exactly the same way. The metal doors finally close, locking them inside a steel box and blocking out the massacre upstairs. The sudden quiet rings in their ears. Adrian rests his heavy head against Leia, his chest barely rising. She wraps her arms tight around him, her voice cracking as she pleads with him to keep his eyes open. He quietly tells her she was a fool to come back. She shakes her head with absolute stubbornness, telling him she does not abandon people. In this moment, she changes her life forever, chaining herself to a fading boss. They stumble into the garage and throw his dead weight into the back of a waiting car. Leia presses her entire body weight into his chest wound to slow the blood. It proves a beautiful point. We only discover our true strength when we are forced to fight for someone else's survival. The car rips through the dark streets, smearing the neon lights across the glass. Leia looks down at the man, fading away right in her lap. His breathing hitches in rough gasps, a clear sign that his organs are failing. Clawing for some illusion of control, she screams at Dante to tell her where they are going. Dante says absolutely nothing. Leia pushes her slippery hands even deeper against Adrian's ruined side. Stick with me here, because this is a profoundly human reaction. She behaves as if she can trap his soul inside his ribcage by applying physical pressure, begging him not to leave her. Slowly, Adrian moves his arm. His cold fingers find her hand in the shadows and hold on.
It a quiet truth about us all. Even the most hearted people will reach out
For a hand to hold when the lights finally go out. Adrian is choking on his blood, but he still manages to drag out one final order. He instructs Leia to find his hidden cache, erase her identity, and run far away. Even with one foot in a coffin, he refuses to stop managing her safety. Leia breaks down, demanding to know why a boss would care so deeply about her. His response completely destroys the myth of the ruthless kingpin. He whispers that saving her is the single good thing he has done in a decade. We have to wonder if this is genuine regret or just a dying criminal trying to purchase a clean conscience. He loses consciousness before she can speak. Up front, Dante stares at the road and states they have 20 minutes left. It reminds us of a bitter fact. Spent waiting the first fire just a few seconds of at the very end. You and I need to look to the face closely right now, because this is the exact moment everything shifts. This man ceased being just a captor. He transformed into the only person who actually saw her. She is not simply scared he will die. She is terrified of losing her solitary anchor. The car skids to a halt at an isolated cabin, where a numb underground doctor rushes out. When he dresses Adrian inside and slams a street wedgie in Leia's face, the separation strikes her like a physical blow. She stands frozen in the dim hallway, shaking with raw adrenaline, her clothes completely soaked in his warm blood. The brutal life lesson here is undeniable. Surviving physical violence is often much easier than surviving the suffocating, empty quiet of the aftermath. Dante steps from the shadows and hands her a clean towel. It is as a small gesture, an attempt to wipe away the visible horror painted on her skin. Leia takes it and begins scrubbing her stained arms like a machine, her eyes completely hollow. She immediately starts blaming herself, whispering how a history with Ethan and the Viscaris family brought them to this ruin. Dante refuses to let her spiral. He grabs her shoulders, forcing her gaze to meet his, and insists that Adrian is too stubborn to perish. He warns her to brace herself for the sheer hell coming next. Dante knows exactly how this dark world operates. Guilt is a completely useless emotion when fighting to survive, draining the exact energy required to keep breathing. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The sheer agony of waiting will completely break a person down. Leia collapses onto the hard floor, her nerves entirely frayed. The terrible hours drag by in thick silence. When the morning sun bleeds through the window, it offers no comfort, only illuminating the dried blood still caked on her trembling hands. Eventually, the exhausted doctor steps into the hall, quietly announcing he is stable for now. Leia's legs nearly give out from the sudden rush of relief. She pushes her way into the dim bedroom, and the tragic sight steals her breath. This untouchable, terrifying man is now just a fragile, broken thing resting on a narrow bed. No matter how much absolute power a person commands, we are all just fragile flesh and bone in the end. Leia drags a heavy chair right to his bedside. She gently takes his cold hand, terrified her touch might cause him more pain. Staring down at his pale face, she softly whispers, idiot for ever believing he was invincible. That sharp scolding is merely a desperate release valve for her crushing fear. The anger quickly fades, and she completely breaks down. She buries her face against his skin, weeping and begging him to open his eyes. While she cries in the quiet dark, the criminal world outside is actively burning. The Viscaris Syndicate has triggered a bloody turf war that is tearing the entire city apart. True terror rarely comes from the violent war raging outside our walls. It actually comes from the quiet realization of what we stand to lose inside our own hearts. I want you to think about this profound shift with me. For 6 brutal years, Leia was married to Ethan, a cruel man who trained her to be entirely submissive. But sitting opposite a hardened criminal like Adrian, she feels an emotional fire she has never experienced. It is a fierce, almost violent sense of loyalty. It changes the very foundation of who she is. Suddenly, Adrian's pale fingers twitch. His heavy eyelids flutter open, his dark eyes darting around the room, frantically hunting for hidden threats. Leia leans in close, her voice soft and desperately trying to calm his racing mind. The life lesson here is as sharp as a blade. Extreme trauma does not merely break us down into shattered pieces. It completely rewires who we are fundamentally capable of becoming. Adrian's first conscious thought cuts straight through his physical pain. His voice is a broken rasp as he reminds her that he explicitly ordered her to leave. Leia does not even blink. She leans closer, quietly repeating her permanent new rule. She simply does not leave her people behind. For a split second, the faint ghost of a smile tugs at his mouth, a tiny, tragic moment of emotional validation before his exhausted body drags him back into sleep. But that soft relief ends quickly. Dante's imposing frame fills the doorway. bringing the freezing reality of their brutal world right back. The Viscaris family just dropped a massive bounty on their heads. Safety is always a fragile illusion. The second you stop running is the exact moment the worst monsters catch your scent. Leia turns to look directly at Dante, the cold man who dragged her from the shadows. He calmly lays out a plan of pure aggression. They must hunt down the Viscaris leaders and make the price of chasing them written entirely in blood. It sounds like a suicide mission, but Dante swears it is their only way out. Watch her body language carefully. Her trembling hands slowly curl into tight, resolute fists. Her mind flashes through the recent horrors, her dead husband, the wet blood in the hallway, the terrified wife she used to be. That old version of Leia is completely dead. She lifts her chin, fully embracing the darkness of the violent underworld. Sometimes the only way to defeat the terrifying monsters in the dark is stare right into the shadows and become one yourself. Look closely at Dante's reaction here. His dark pupils dilate, a razor slit scratch crack in his icy mask. This soft civilian woman is suddenly standing right before him, demanding to be trained for a brutal bloodbath. Most people would call this bravery, but it is actually a massive trauma response. She is violently rejecting the role of the helpless victim, clawing desperately for any scrap of control in a waking nightmare. Dante, he stares at her, silently weighing her fragile mental state before he finally offers a single nod. But he sets a brutal condition. She must Frisian obey his every command without question. She has exactly 48 hours to completely tear down everything she believes about right and wrong. Sheer survival often forces us to forge deadly weapons out of our own broken pieces. Stick with me on this, because this is where the human mind gets truly terrifying. It takes less than 2 days for a normal person to throw away their moral compass when raw survival is all that is left. Leia is not looking for justice anymore. Her overwhelmed brain has locked her trauma in a dark box, replacing her paralyzing fear with a desperate need for violence. Worrying about right and wrong is a civilian luxury she cannot afford. The severe lack of sleep pushes her further over the edge. Every time she blinks, she feels Adrian's warm blood soaking her hands all over again. Long before the morning sun comes up, Dane shoves a heavy, freezing steel pistol right into her shaking hands. Our fragile minds will adapt to pure horror much faster than any of us ever want to admit. The fact that she knows nothing about weapons is Dante's biggest advantage. He stands close, molding her stance, forcing her body into a rigid posture that bypasses her emotional panic. His voice is a steady, low hum, instructing her to squeeze the trigger gently, not to yank it. It is a mechanical motion designed to trick the brain, making the violent act feel impersonal. The gun is just a heavy metal tool. She lines up her sights on glass bottles 50 feet away. Her first 19 shots wildly miss. Her arms shake too hard, and the vicious recoil bruises her shoulder. But on the 20th shot, a bottle finally shatters into dust. The life lesson here is deeply dark. If you practice anything long enough, even pure violence eventually starts to feel like a twisted reward. Picture the camera pushing in slowly on Leia's face. Her battered hands tremble as her eyes lock onto a scattered mosaic of broken glass across the cold concrete floor. Dante's voice sharply cuts through the silence, dark and uncompromising. He tells her that simply knowing how to pull a trigger means absolutely nothing. When the violent moment actually comes, the human brain screams to run. Basic evolution will paralyze her lungs and freeze her blood. She must actively override her own ingrained humanity. She must consciously agree to extinguish another soul before the gun is even drawn. A sudden cramp twists her stomach, and she fights the physical urge to be sick. The hardest truth in life is that becoming a monster to survive is always a conscious, completely irreversible choice. Watch the relentless, mechanical rhythm of her bruised hands. The camera focuses tight on her raw cuticles and the dark swelling spreading across her palms. Leia clings to her past tragedies like a desperate lifeline. She uses Ethan's death and the haunting image of Adrian fighting for a single breath as her emotional fuel. She softly whispers her solemn vow to fight, but Dante refuses to accept mere words. He forces her back into the agonizing training loop, over and over again, for 48 exhausted hours. He physically hammers the violence deep into her muscle memory until her conscious mind is entirely erased. Her body is completely broken and failing, but her hesitation is officially dead. This teaches us a brutal, lingering reality. Pain, when repeated long enough, eventually silences the human conscience. The camera glides through the heavy shadows of advancement. Somewhere in the dark, water steadily drips, keeping time like a metronome against Leia's racing pulse. Dante offers her absolutely nothing, no comfort, no reassurance. He intentionally starves her of approval to keep her nerves entirely exposed. Firing a weapon is merely the first step. He drills her on clearing doorways, melting into concrete pillars and scanning a room in a fraction of a second. His ultimate rule is total mental blackout. If a hostile shadow moves, she cannot pause to think. She must simply pull the trigger.
We see a harsh truth here. Sometimes surviving the worst storms in life means turning off the very overthinking that makes us human.
Relying entirely on raw, unfiltered instinct to carry us through. Look at the subtle tension in Dante's jaw when he talks about his own potential death. He speaks of friendly fire with a terrifying, ice-cold logic, treating his murder as just another acceptable statistic. Leia's eyes, however, reveal her lingering humanity. She is deeply afraid of hurting innocent people, but Dante is relentless. He twists that beautiful empathy into a razor-sharp tool, using Adrian's broken body to channel her guilt into a focused rage. They strike a silent agreement in the dark, fully accepting they might burn together. The scene that cuts sharply to the blinding white of a recovery room where a monitor maps Adrian's fragile heartbeat. It shows us how guilt is a dangerous thing. It can quietly warp the kindest persons into a weapon for someone else's bitter war. You and I should look closely at this quiet, tragic moment by the bedside. The lighting is soft, painting long shadows across the room. Leia tightly holds his feverish hand, silently seeking permission from the man who dragged her into this violent mess. She whispers her dark intentions, fully aware he would never let her walk into the fire. But this is where her true motive bleeds through the cracks. For 6 long years, she lived as a captive ghost in her own life. Now she is violently ripping back the reins of her own destiny. She leans in close, her voice shaking with a desperate intensity, begging him to wake up. We often miss this truth about human nature. People will willingly march straight into a raging fire as long as they believe they are the ones choosing to walk that path. The rustle of thick Kevlar fills the room as Dante hands her the armor. It smells of synthetic fibers and old dried blood. He studies the quiet terror in her eyes with silent relief. If she were completely numb, she would be a fate liability. Her fear is the anchor keeping her tied to reality. The camera cuts to a massive shot of the Viscari compound. It is a brutal monolith of cold concrete, swarming with guards. Surviving a breach here seems mathematically impossible, yet Dante's eyes hold a calculating spark. He knows their shift rotations, their tired moments, and the supreme arrogance of their leaders. A fortress is never truly impenetrable. It isn't only as strong as the pride of the men standing watch, and unchecked pride is always the very first wall to crumble. Inside the transport van, the pre-dawn shadows paint the operatives in cold, bruised colors. The silence feels heavy and suffocating. They are a ghost unit of only 8, driving straight toward a slaughterhouse of 20 trained killers. The camera pans across their tense faces. A man named Lopez, his face marked by thick scars, cracks a morbid joke. For a fleeting second, forced laughter cuts through the stale air, releasing a spike of raw adrenaline. But the silence crashes right back down. Leia does not smile. Her eyes remain entirely vacant. Retreating deep into the sanctuary of her conditioned mind, she pulls back the slide. Ammunition confirmed, safety engaged. When faced with overwhelming chaos, we all naturally seek shelter in the simple, predictable comfort of a familiar routine. Stick with me here because this is the exact moment theory bleeds into terrifying reality. The massive iron silhouette of the tears through the morning mist. Leia's chest rises in sharp, jagged gasps. Her heart hammers violently against her ribs, and cold sweat pools inside her tactical gloves. Dante demands absolute silence. The camera captures the soft squeal of yielding metal as they quietly pry open the perimeter fence. They slip into the belly of the beast, navigating a chaotic maze of towering crates. The layout is a nightmare designed to trap intruders. The safety of her basement training is gone, replaced by the suffocating grip of the unknown. We can practice for disaster our entire lives, but nothing truly prepares us for the moment the fire finally touches our skin. The frame drowns in the sickly, yellow glare of overhead sodium lights. Every distant footstep from an unaware guard feels like a rusted blade scraping across Leia's frayed nerves. Dante weaves them through the dense shadows, inching closer to the reinforced heart of the syndicate. And then the world violently shatters. The breaching charges detonate with a concussive roar that shakes the floorboards. The shockwave rips away reality, plunging everyone into a hurricane of horror. Deafening echoes ring out. High-velocity bullets bite fiercely into the concrete walls. Dante's unit floods into the choking smoke, and Leia is dragged violently into the current. There is no turning back now. True survival completely strips away the illusion of choice, reducing us to nothing but raw forward motion. The narrow hallway instantly transforms into a claustrophobic nightmare. Strobe flashes of muzzle fire cast erratic shadows against the cold concrete walls. Just as Dante planned, Leia's conscious mind completely shifts. A figure steps into the fatal funnel. She doesn't process a human face, only a deadly threat. Her finger pulls the trigger before she can draw a breath. The heavy recoil violently snaps her wrist back. The target drops hard, clutching a ruined shoulder. A sudden wave of intense nausea crashes over her. Her soul screams at the sight of the shattered body on the floor. But Dante shoves her heart from behind, forcing her boots to keep moving through the thick smoke. In the darkest moments of our lives, the luxury of grief must always wait until we are safely on the other side.
Let's pause for a second and look at the psychology inside this room. The heavy steel door falls away, exposing the syndicate's lavish nerve center. Right in the middle sits the patriarch,
Carlo Viscari. The camera pushes in slowly on his face, waiting for a flicker of panic, but there is absolutely none. Surrounded by armed operatives, his heart rate doesn't even spike. He looks at Dante, not with terror, but with a bone-chilling, arrogant boredom. He views the guns pointed at his chest as a mere inconvenience. His calm is entirely disconnected from the brutal reality of the situation. It is a haunting reflection of human nature. Supreme arrogance blinds even the most ruthless predators to their own fragile mortality. Believing you are entirely untouchable is the exact flaw that guarantees your fall. The tension in the air is absolutely suffocating. Carlo sinks deep into his leather chair, entirely ignoring the chaos outside. He turns his predatory gaze upon Leia, his voice dripping with venom. He coldly calls her by her old name. It is a calculated psychological strike designed to drag her backward into her past victimhood. Leia's shoulders tense up, her jaw locking in violent rejection. With the surgical precision, Carlo rips open her deepest emotional wounds. He tells her that Ethan never loved her, that he only molded her like clay to show off a prized possession. He openly mocks her trembling weapon, calling her a broken pawn playing soldier. We see a painful truth here. The most devastating wounds are never inflicted by bullets, but by the cruel words that validate our deepest insecurities. A sadistic smirk curls across Carlo's face, driving the final blade deep into her psyche. He coldly states that Ethan's death was entirely her fault. In the ruthless hierarchy of this criminal empire, a man who cannot control his wife is simply a liability that must be erased. The force of his words hits Leia like a physical blow. The camera focuses on her finger, trembling violently against the cold steel of the trigger. Dante barks her name, desperate to pull her out of this psychological freefall. But the damage is already done. She begins to whisper the names of the dead, pulling the crushing weight of their blood onto her own soul. Carlo throws his head back and laughs. Guilt is a dark and terrible prison, and if we are not careful, we will willingly lock the door from the inside. Carlo's laughter bitterly echoes through the cold room, holding the empty amusement of a man completely stripped of his soul. He mocks their bond, promising them an agonizing end. Let us look closely here. You and I. Life teaches us that arrogance is always a fragile shield. Dante suddenly shatters it, ending the speech with a single, deafening gunshot straight to Carlo's chest. The violence snaps the silence in two. Carlo jerks backward, a crimson stain blooming across his white shirt. His eyes go wide with the shock of a monster, realizing he can finally bleed. Then, absolute chaos erupts. A woman screams, and the younger Viscari heir scrambles away like a cornered beast. Gunfire tears through the plaster walls. Leia hits the floor hard, diving behind a heavy wooden table as enemy reinforcements flood the corridor. Dante flat out refuses to retreat. His grim obsession with killing buries any instinct to survive as he drops two guards in a breath. In the shadows, Leia watches the younger Viscari scramble toward a secret exit. Sometimes in life, true courage is not the absence of fear, but the realization that something else matters more. She throws her terror away and sprints across the lethal room. Bullets shatter the plaster beside her head, yet her gaze stays locked. She catches the trembling air just as his fingers brush the door. He spins around, weapon raised, but Leia beats him to the draw. Her wild shot is fueled by pure panic, tearing brutally through his leg. He hits the floor, screaming in agony, while she stands above him, the heavy iron weapon trembling in her hands. A chilling numbness washes over Leia. When she commands the boy to stay down, her tone is completely flat. It is the sound of a woman detached from her own soul. The bleeding air defies her, spitting blood and daring her to shoot. Her finger tightens on the trigger as her memory flashes to 6 endless years of torment. But here is a quiet truth we all eventually learn. True strength often lies in refusing to become the monster the world tried to make you. She cannot execute him in cold blood. She lowers the weapon. The air breathes a sigh of relief, lasting barely 1 second before Dante calmly puts a bullet through his skull. The deafening crack and the sudden spray of red make Leia violently sick. Without a single look back, Dante grabs her arm and roars for them to move. Survival takes over.
They plunge down the stairwell.
March. Dante cuts them down with the precision of a starving wolf. Leia is trapped in her own head. Trauma is deeply isolating, locking us in our darkest memories even as the world burns. The gunfire fades into a high-ringing sound. Her vision shrinks. She cannot feel her feet hitting the concrete, seeing only the looping image of the boy dying. They burst through the doors into absolute chaos. Sirens wail into the night, and searchlights sweep over the swarming guards. Dante charges toward the fence. When Lopez takes a brutal bullet to the ribs, the men simply grab his bloody collar, dragging his heavy frame through the broken perimeter and vanishing into the dark. Look closely at them now, you and I, as the adrenaline burns away into pure terror. They collapse into the getaway car, tires screaming as the driver floors the gas. Leia huddles in the back, gasping for air while tremors shake her bones. Her hands are painted red. We discovers what we truly value only when pushed to the absolute brink of losing it. Dante presses a phone to his ear, admitting they are compromised. The voice on the line is a dark murmur, yet Dante's jaw clenches like stone. When Leia weakly begs for the truth, he turns to her with eyes carrying absolute dread. He reveals the enemy's final, devastating trap. A hit squad has been sent directly to their safe house. Leia feels her heart stop beating. Adrian is lying there in the dark, entirely defenseless. Dante runs the brutal numbers. The guards are outnumbered, the gates, and they are 30 agonizing minutes away. Raw panic erupts from Leia. She screams at the driver to go faster, tearing her throat until it tastes like copper. The car violently shakes pushed to the edge of breaking apart. Time is truly the cruelest thief when you are desperate, stretching every second into an eternity. Leia pictures Adrian lying in that silent bed, trapped in a coma. Desperate to keep her mind from fracturing, she checks her pistol. 3 bullets left. Her hands tremor much she can barely humbly hold the metal. Dante fiercely orders her to stay hidden in the car when they arrive. But true devotion always demands we walk into the people we cherish. She will never let Adrian die alone. She accepts she might not survive the night, refusing to play the quiet victim of...
Dante switches her eyes, seeing that terrifying resolve, and orders her to mirror his every step.
You and I have seen this powerful shift before, haven't we? It is that defining moment when life forces a broken surrender or become the warrior. The cabin emerges through the trees. The sight is catastrophic. Bodies litter the muddy ground. The vehicles slams to a halt, and Dante's men pour out with weapons raised. Leia trails behind, her heart hammering as the heavy echo of gunshots rings out from inside the house. That's a stop. They step through the shattered doorway together. The living room is a complete slaughterhouse. Furniture is splintered into pieces, and every wall is painted in absolute tragedy. Thick blood coats the floors. The guards Dante left behind have been wiped out. Down the hallway, a terrifying standoff unfolds. A nameless assassin stands calmly over Adrian's helpless body. He has the empty eyes of a true sociopath. Life teaches us a terrifying lesson here. True evil does not shout. It speaks in a simple whisper. His voice is chillingly flat as he orders them to drop their weapons, promising to shoot Adrian if they flinch. Dante freezes in the doorway, his finger resting on the trigger. Leia shakes so violently she can barely stand. The killer offers his ghost, a smile basking in his out-of-control over their fate. Then a broken whisper floats up from the sheets. Adrian is barely awake. his mind drowning in main killer's signature. Yet he desperately forces his pale lips to breathe Leia's name. Fighting through pain, Adrienne's weary eyes lock onto Leia. He tries to beg her to run, but the assassin shuts that down. The killer makes the rules clear. One wrong move, and Adrienne dies. Dante steps forward, desperately trying to negotiate. The assassin shrugs, explaining his bosses are dead and his contract is void. Life teaches us that the most dangerous people are those who have absolutely nothing left to lose. He stays out of a twisted need to finish the job. He glares at Leia, blaming her for burning his criminal world down. His plan, painfully cruel, he intends in spurns to force her to watch the man she loves die, then slaughter the room. Leia's terrified eyes dart to the dropped pistol. Stripped of all her power, she falls to her trembling knees and desperately begs, offering the smiling monster anything he desires.
Let's stop and truly examine this tragic crossroads together, you and I. The killer smiles and hands Leia an impossible choice. He tells her to end her own life, promising that Adrienne will live.
The room goes perfectly silent. All Leia hears is the deafening drumming of her own heart. Adrienne fights against his shattered body, coughing up blood as he tries to scream at her to stop. The assassin simply presses a heavy hand against his wounded chest. Leia looks down at Adrienne. This is the man who pulled her out of the dark, who carefully glued her broken pieces back together. She glances at Dante, whose stoic face twists into pure horror. In the end, profound love always buries the basic human instinct to survive. She slowly walks toward the cold firearm, completely tuning out Adrienne's raw, agonizing cries of pure despair. She stares into the killer's eyes, begging him to swear he will keep his word. The assassin smoothly promises his twisted integrity. Dante roars, begging her not to fall for this sick game, but Leia slowly raises the steel barrel to her temple.
Notice how her trembling hands suddenly go still. There is a profound truth here. Accepting your own end brings a strange, terrifying peace.
She whispers a tearful apology to Adrienne. He thrashes against the mattress, screaming and cursing her name, fighting a body that simply will not move. She loves him and firmly pulls the trigger. A loud metallic click echoes through the room. The chamber is empty. The assassin blinks, his brain stalling in confusion. In that tiny, fractured second, Dante explodes forward like a coiled spring, violently snapping the killer's wrist and tearing the weapon away. The stray gun fires wildly, tearing plaster from the ceiling. Dante tackles the killer, driving his mass through the drywall in a brutal struggle. Leia snaps back to reality. She spots a discarded pistol near a fallen guard. She scoops it up just as the assassin breaks Dante's hold, swinging his barrel toward Dante's chest. Leia does not blink. She pulls the trigger, burying a bullet deep into the killer dubs. He staggers, his dead eyes snapping toward her in pure rage. Leia stands her ground and empties the magazine into his chest, firing until the metal clicks. The monster finally crumbles into a bleeding heap. Life teaches us that surviving a true nightmare always leaves a deep, quiet scar. A heavy silence rushes back into the room. Leia drops the smoking gun. Adrian opens his mouth, but the trauma of the long night has left him entirely mute. Let us open the files for together, you and I, and observe the frame and frame where a shattered soul binds itself to its breaker. Leia collapses beside the ruined mattress, pouring apologies over the men orchestrated her nightmare. Adrian grips her trembling hand, and Brett grips a camper his throat to destroyed, his words a gravelly rasp, calling her insane. She had turned a weapon on herself just to save him. Oblivious to its empty chamber, it is a harsh truth of our existence. Sometimes our deepest wounds disguise themselves as profound love. He orders her never to risk her life again, but she merely reflects his dark devotion. They are drowning in a shared delusion, clinging to one another until Dante fractures the cinematic tableau, warning that more men are quickly approaching. Watch the subtle shift in gravity in the frame. Leia, once a terrified captive, now studies Adrian with a clinical, detached focus. She asks Dante if the bleeding syndicate leader can survive a journey. Fueled by diabolik arrogance, Adrian forces his shattered body upright. They heave his dead weight into the extraction van and tearing away into the black night. Leia stares through the glass, her eyes mourning the burning wreckage of the hell she had grown to know. It is human nature to cling to our familiar cages when we are terrified of the unknown sky above. She asks Dante if the war is over, and he nods, confirming a terribly fragile peace. Adrian rests his heavy head against her shoulder, his ragged, shallow breathing becoming the steady anchor of her entire existence. Leia tightly shuts her eyes, fighting the suffocating wave of her altered reality. She's crossed a psychological line drawn in blood, taking lives and offering her own heart as collateral. The trembling girl Adrian, pulled from that damp alleyway, simply no longer exists. She has been burned away, leaving behind a hardened, tragic mirror of the monster who took her. Personal transformation always demands a brutal sacrifice of the old self. The van rolls up to a waterfront fortress, a concrete stronghold flawlessly masquerading as a quiet vacation home. They arrive exactly as dawn breaks. The sky bleeds, soft pink and brilliant gold across the water, casting a devastatingly beautiful illusion of peace over three Hiva souls absolutely drenched in irreversible psychological trauma. Observe the dark hidden machinery that keeps a vicious predator breathing. Adrian is rapidly fading, a broken shell forced forward only by arrogant stubbornness. Dante and Leia carry his lifeless weight across the threshold into the dimly lit living room. An underground physician waits in the shadows, scanning the ruined crime boss. Wealth and power can buy temporary silence, but they can never negotiate with death. The grim medical assessment sends Leia into a quiet, panicked frenzy. The doctor demands a hospital, a desperate plea that Dante rejects with a voice like cracked ice. Adrian must remain perfectly still, or he will drown in his own blood. Dante coldly accepts the strict demand for a month of absolute rest, sealing their isolated fate without a single hesitation. The physician shifts her intense gaze to Leia, silently taking in the visual poetry of her survival. Leia stands wrapped in garbus mesbly with dried blood, her hands torn and a dark bruise shadowing her temple. Like any survivor carrying heavy trauma, she instinctively minimizes her pain, whispering that she is perfectly fine. But ignoring our deepest wounds never heals them. It merely buries them alive. The doctor dismisses her empty denial, pointing her down a hallway to strip away the physical horror. The invisible psychological chain binding Leia to Adrian pulls tight, mailing pies, making her physically resist leaving his side. Yet watching his pale face and listening to his strained breaths, she realizes her dark anchor is stationary. Defeated, she finally turns away to wash off the blood. In the shower, Leia turns the water to scalding heat. It is a desperate, punishing ritual to shock her shattered nervous system. She scrubs on the fragile skin until the burning sensation eclipses the phantom weight of the weapon she fired. She tries to melt the agonizing memory of press-caused steel against her skull. The hardest lesson of any survival story is that you can never truly wash away the person you have become to stay alive. As stepping out in an absolute daze, she finds fresh clothes left by unseen hands, pulling them on with chilling mechanical detachment. She extinguished several lives tonight, their physical already blurring into nameless shapes. She braces for a crushing moral collapse, but searching her battered soul, she discovers only a profound, terrifying emotional void. Beneath that numbness, a terrifying psychological adaptation slowly blooms. A chilling realization takes root. She would gladly pull the trigger and execute them all over again. When we embrace the darkness to protect what we love, the monster inside us permanently stops hiding. Such a total moral collapse should spark panic, but it only brings crushing mental exhaustion. Fighter G, she drifts back into the main room, watching Dante bark damaging control in sharp Italian. Leia drops to the floor beside the unconscious Kingpin as sedatives deploy into his ruined veins. Dante lowers his phone, his face carved with grim shadows. He delivers a heavy truth. Adrian will survive if they can keep this fragile sanctuary perfectly sealed. The relentless violence waiting just outside their doors. Dante sinks into a chair, mapping out the grim architecture of the criminal underworld. The rival syndicate may be headless, he explains, but massive power vacuums always breed vicious chaos. Fresh predators will inevitably rise to hunt them down. This endless cycle of paranoia is their permanent reality now. Leia stares at the broken man lying beside her, whispering a desperate wish to walk away. But true freedom requires knowing exactly who you are without your chains. Dante leans forward, coldly asking where she would even go. Her silence exposes a terrifying lack of identity. Then, with devastating psychological precision, he praises her brutal efficiency in the firefight, expertly spinning her suicidal desperation into a dark heroism that seals her trauma bond tighter than ever before. Let us examine how Dante surgically strips away her lingering guilt. He coldly reminds her that pulling the trigger is the only reason Adrian is still breathing. When she confesses she did not know the weapon was empty, Dante poses a damning question. If it had been loaded, would she have pulled it anyway? Her tense shoulders tighten, and her trembling jaw answers before she can even speak. We reveal our truest selves, not in beautiful words, but in what we are genuinely willing to die for. Dante smiles grimly, thoroughly validating her dark, irreversible choices. He crowns her a fully evolved survivor of their vicious world, then quietly exits. For 3 grueling hours, she sits alone with the bleeding man until a ragged hitch in his breathing snaps her vigilant mind instantly awake. Stick with me, because you and I must look closely at the psychological chess match that happens next. Leia finds the bleeding narcissist awake, his dark eyes locked intensely onto hers. He forces a bitter joke to mask his profound physical weakness. That feeling like he got shot makes perfect sense. His toxic ego tries to force his body upright, but blinding pain aggressively slams him back down. Leia rushes forward, her hands instinctively adjusting his pillows to protect his torn flesh. Confronting our own mortality is often the only mirror that how to protect life. His face softens into a rare, calculated tenderness. He scolds her for running into a bloodbath, demanding she never risk her life again. She simply holds his stare and throws his exact logic right back at him. The bleeding syndicate leader twists his fractured reality, arguing that his violent sacrifices are entirely different from hers. He paints a fabricated picture of her future, insisting she still retains enough purity to escape this criminal underworld. But the promise of light means nothing to a soul that has learned to thrive in total darkness. Leia leans close, her face mere inches from his. She shatters his desperate fantasy, whispering that she does not even want to leave. Adrian tightens his grip on her hand, trying to anchor her as he describes an endless, suffocating cycle of blood. He begs her to believe she is an innocent anomaly. Leia simply stares into his eyes and lists the men she just slaughtered, proving her innocence died the second he pulled her from the shadows. Adrian tries to claw back his fading power, ordering her to forge a new identity and disappear. But Leia aggressively rejects the escape, refusing to help be a helpless victim running from her own shadow. True empowerment sometimes wears a terrifying, jagged mask. Adrian pivots, dismissing her bravery as blind survival. Leia leans over his ruined body, finally seizing control of her life in the most beautifully broken way possible. She gritty dissects her tragic history. For 6 years, her former abuser built the walls of her reality. Then Adrian stole her, locking her inside a fortified cage under the strict gaze of salvation. Her voice never wavers as she admits the darkest truth. She only let him play the savior because her mind was completely destroyed long before they met. The madness of this story hits its peak in one incredibly devastating frame. Sharp shadows fall across Leia's face under the cold room lights. She breathes out a complete surrender, telling him her captivity is what she wants. She's locking herself inside a cage and handing the keys to the very warden who built it. Adrian knows violence better than anyone. He looks at her and sees the deep fracture in her mind, the heavy weight of fresh trauma. But Leia pushes past reason, claiming a deep romantic bond with her captor. The silence that follows is heavy. She truly believes his total control is just a different kind of freedom. It reminds us of a hard truth. Sometimes the most dangerous lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves just to survive the night. You and I really need to look closely at the total devastation in this exchange. The camera stays on Adrian, catching a tiny crack in his usual cold armor. He actually tries to push her away, listing out his terrible sins and admitting he is a lethal man. But Leia just holds tighter to her broken pieces. Her eyes burn with a stubborn fire. She takes his brief moments of protection and uses them to justify his crimes, matching them to her own shattered morals. He tells her she needs to heal and find a safe life, but she completely rejects the light. She demands the dark. The predator just stands there, staring at the tragic work of art he created. It shows how hurt people often cling to the familiar pain, simply because it feels safer than the unknown. The lighting shifts, pulling them into a dark, haunting intimacy. He brings her close, resting his forehead against hers in a perfectly calculated show of fake vulnerability. He whispers that she will regret this, carefully wrapping the emotional chains around her mind. He offers her zero safety. Leia answers with a shaking voice, saying that a normal life only got her beaten down. Now she actively craves the chaos. She leans in for a desperate kiss, tasting tears and fresh blood, completely mistaking her basic survival instinct for true romances. He kisses back with a hungry, cold precision. When they step apart, his soft promise of love seals her fate. We learn a painful lesson here. Love built on a foundation of fear is just another form of control. Come into this frame with me, because this is exactly where a psychological trap snaps shut. Leia asks what happens next, the tension clear in her neck as she faces the unknown. Adrian whispers a promise that they will heal, painting a lovely but entirely empty picture. So, we cut to the outside streets where the criminal underground is tearing itself to shreds. Rival families fall apart in a mess of sirens and blood. But inside their heavy walls, time just stops. Adrian recovers slowly, making sure he becomes the only beating heart in her tiny universe. Dante stays in the shadows and pulling the strings to keep her logged in. It reminds us that isolation is a slow poison. Real love expands your world, while manipulation shrinks it down to a single room. Inside this quiet bubble, a dangerous confusion takes hold of her mind. Leia goes through days without facing active physical terror. She stops measuring every breath she takes. But this fake freedom actually tortures her anxious nerves. When the sun sets, the hidden trauma bleeds out. She wakes up shaking violently, the loud crack of a gunshot and the sight of dark blood burned into her memory. In the dark, Adrian holds her trembling body. He stays perfectly quiet, a cold trick he sadly mistakes for real empathy. During the day, she watches the ocean, and this prison is a home. But true peace cannot grow in poisoned soil. When Marcus steps into the light with his cruel smile, he shatters the illusion and brings the violence right back to her door. The camera follows Marcus as he leans on the doorframe, casually pointing out that she has finally gone to war. She stares down at her own hands. She describes the feeling as falling down a black hole and finally hitting the hard concrete. It is a chilling moment where a broken mind can find comfort in the absolute dark. Soon, the brutal physical training starts again. Sweat drips from her face as she pushes her muscles to the breaking point, trying to sweat out the deep trauma in her blood. She wants to rebuild a soul that is already gone. Then, on the 23rd day, the mood in the house shifts. Adrian stands up from his chair, a giant shadow taking back his crown. It shows us that true healing never comes from punishing your own body to run from your past. The dim light throws long shadows across the face of Dante as he explains their grim situation. The rival group is dead, but the empty throne is drawing hungry wolves to their door. Dante tells them to wash the blood off their hands, sell the empire, and vanish for good. But Leia narrows her eyes. Her damaged mind completely rejects the idea of a quiet, peaceful life.
She calls it running away. The only other option is pure madness, taking the crown and living in endless fear. Adrian stays perfectly calm. Then, in a clever move of control,
he looks right at Leia, and asks what they should do. The shock on her face seals her fate. It teaches us a grim truth. Giving someone a fake choice is often the easiest way to make them lock their own chains. The lens moves in slowly, catching the exact second her soul permanently binds to his. Leia remembers the scared, fragile woman bleeding in the freezing rain, the one who would have begged for a quiet life. But that woman is totally gone. She speaks with a steady, haunting voice, giving life to a tragic lie. She believes that becoming the monster is the only way to protect herself from the monsters. She tells them to stand their ground, using future bloodshed as her shield. Marcus watches from the corner with a wicked grin, lets her dark words hang in the heavy air, enjoying his victory before he promises to build an iron fortress. We see here that trauma often tricks us into becoming the exact thing that hurt us in the first place. Dante clenches his jaw, fully aware they just promised a bloody war. But Adrian keeps his voice smooth, making the coming violence sound like a beautiful show of strength. In the cold days that follow, a brutal clearing of the ranks begins. We watch Adrian cut ties and kill anyone who shows even a hint of doubt. Through it all, Leia just stands by and watches the horror unfold. She sees human lives treated like cheap wooden pieces on a chessboard. She swallows the poison of this life, lying to her own face in the mirror. She tries to believe this loud brutality is somehow more honest than the quiet cruelty of her old life. It is a sad reminder that a broken mind will justify any horror if it stops the pain of feeling weak. The sound so clear. 6 weeks pass, and the sky bleeds a deep orange as she stands on the balcony to watch the sunset. Adrian steps from the shadows, his dangerous energy fully restored, His deep voice brushes her ear, asking if she regrets letting her old self die to become his shadow. She stares right into the eyes of the killer and swears she feels no regret at all. He rewards her loyalty by holding her close. She leans back, finding comfort in the same fire that destroyed her life. Then he casually mentions her old abuse, saying his estate is falling apart. It proves that burying your past does not erase it. The ghost always waits for you in the dark. You might be wondering how someone fully gives up their identity. And this is exactly how it happens. His tone scary and casual when he tells her the world has officially declared her dead. Every single trace of who she used to be is wiped out. He offers her a huge dramatic choice. Walk back into the light to take back her name, or stay hidden in the dark as a ghost forever. He throws the cage door wide open, perfectly confident his broken bird will not fly away. Leia looks out at the horizon, remembering the shiny, miserable life she left behind. With a totally cold voice, she tells him to let her old world burn to ashes. He kisses her softly, sealing her choice. It shows us that freedom means nothing if you have forgotten how to fly. The sky turns pitch black. Let us look at the painful poetry of the final moment together. She practically begs to know what their future holds, but he refuses to give her any solid ground to stand on. He wants her lost in his violent waves. She whispers her biggest fear out loud, that she might lose him. The irony hurts to watch. The little lamb is crying over the thought of losing the big bad wolf. He gives her no comfort at all, simply stating there are zero guarantees when you live by the gun. He dresses up cold terror to look like deep honesty. He holds her shaking face in his rough hands, making one single promise. If they drown, they will sink together. It leaves us with a haunting truth to carry. Sometimes, the worst kind of prison is the one you happily lock from the inside. Let us look at this frame together. The camera lingers as they pull apart. Adrian flashes a calculated smile in the shadows, designed to secure her devotion. He whispers his love, yet Leia never flinches. She calmly admits she loves the monster breathing beneath his skin. This is the climax of their trauma bond, where the poison becomes her cure. 14 days later, we cut to a towering glass penthouse. Entering a crime lord fortress should terrify anyone, but Leia glides into this cage like a quiet sanctuary. She is no longer collateral damage, but the architect of his empire. It reveals a hard truth about human psychology. We do not always sprint away from our darkest of fears. Sometimes, if the terror feels familiar, we stop running and build a permanent home inside it. This next shot captures the exact second her morality mutates. Dante holds his ground while Leia glides into the seat of power. Picture the harsh light of a cold conference room. 90 days later, a trembling debtor sits across from her, offering the pathetic excuses of a drowning man. Just watches. Her eyes are blank, absorbing his panic with unsettling calm. She leans over the mahogany table as the camera pushes in. She speaks with Adrian's cadence, her voice hollow and wiped clean of human empathy. Pay by Friday, she whispers, or lose everything you built. The psychological takeaway here is brutal but deeply honest. If you wear a mask of ruthless cruelty to survive for long enough, your skin heals around it, and that disguise permanently becomes your actual face. The camera lingers as color drains from the debtor's face layers. Promise of violence is absolute. He begs that never comes, and 72 hours later, the debt is settled. In the shadows, Dante observes her chilling smile, watching a fractured mind defend itself through malice. We cut to the cinematic blues of a moonlit bedroom. Tangled in silk sheets, Leia asks Adrian if her new darkness frightens him. He pulls her closer, whispering that this cruelty is her true strength. He adores the monster she is becoming. The psychological tragedy here is profound. Severe trauma does not simply break a person, it completely rewires their internal foundation. We must be incredibly careful about who hands us the blueprints when we rebuild our broken pieces. Stick with me as the camera pulls back to map her psychological shift. When Adrian kissed her, the feeling in her chest was never peace. It was a cold, hard certainty. She had finally stopped being the prey. The scene dissolves to 6 months later. Freezing rain pours over a sprawling graveyard, pushing in on a pathetic headstone. Ethan, her former abuser, lies beneath a cheap rock. There is no grand monument, just a fading name in the downpour. Leia stands over his grave, perfectly still beneath the weeping clouds. This visual teaches us a profound truth about trauma. The emotional closure we desperately chase does not from watching our tormentors get buried in the dirt. True peace only arrives the exact moment we realize our tired legs have finally stopped running. The grey light catches her face as she stares at the mud. She came here expecting a cinematic wave of tears or a rush of vindication. Instead, she deflates us with bone-deep exhaustion. "I am not sorry you are gone," she whispers, heard cutting through the rain. "I am sorry it took me so long to see what you were." In this quiet beat, she is not mourning him. She is grieving the years spent twisting her own morality to survive his madness. "I outlived you," she states, her voice hardening into steel. "I am no longer the fragile girl you try to crush. I am something far more dangerous." This scene leaves us with a heavy psychological truth. Simply waking up and outlasting the abusive forces designed to destroy you is the greatest, most absolute victory you can ever claim. The camera tracks her as she pivots, leaving the dead man to the rain. Adrian waits by a black sedan, offering the support of a partner who understands the dark. He asks no questions as she gets in, letting the graveyard fade in the rearview mirror. It washes away her final fragments of victimhood. We cut forward 12 months. Amber light floods their library, while the underworld hums below the glass. Adrian steps into frame, his jaw clenched. "We have a problem," he murmurs. The camera catches the knowing tilt of her head. "Then let us be smarter," she replies, calmly closing her book. This is the core lesson of survival. When violent chaos knocks at your door, a terrified mind freezes. A truly grounded mind never panics. It simply analyzes the new reality and adapts. You and I have seen many tragedies where broken characters stay broken, but look at this wide shot. Leia and Adrian stand shoulder to shoulder, two predators in a city that eats the weak alive.
She realizes surviving trauma is not about dodging the blade. It is about learning to stitch your own wounds. Her definition of love has mutated. It is no longer a soft safety net,
but a sharp weapon they wield together. She has unearthed a cold capacity for violence deep within her ribs. That terrified girl from the alley is gone, leaving only Leia, a woman with no past, requiring no surname. This is a vital psychological truth. To truly survive the flames, you must let the fire burn your old identity to ash, destroying the mental cage it once built around your spirit. Here is a woman who marched into a blazing inferno and sat down upon its throne. The rain against the glass finally stops. The camera pans to the city below, its lights glowing like a nervous system in the dark. Adrian reaches out, brushing his fingers against hers. When she grips his hand, there is zero hesitation. There is no captive, no savior, and no ghost of a broken victim. There are just two deeply scarred souls standing in the smoking wreckage of their pasts, deciding going to build an empire out of the rubble. The screen fades to black on this final thought. True freedom almost never looks the way society tells you it should. It is rarely a clean break. It is never simple. And it is most often a beautifully messy chaos that belongs to no one but yourself.